Welcome to another episode of Electric City Television's Roundtable Discussions. I'm your host, Travis Prince, and today my guest is Nikki Moser. Hey, Nikki, I'm happy to have you on the show.
Hey, Travis, I'm happy to be here.
So, you're really well-known in Scranton, but for the people who don't know you, I like for my guests to get a little bit of information and background. So just kind of fill us in on who you are, how long you've been in the area, and what kind of art you normally work with.
Well, I'm one of those in and out of the areas. I grew up in Honesdale, so I'm sort of a local girl, and then I left to live in New York City for a long time, and then I ended up back here. And I think materials are really maybe the place where I really love art the most, is that I work in a range of different materials, and often the idea defines the material or decides the material for me. And then I have to learn how to use it, so that's always fun and challenging.
Okay, well, I have a list of questions prepared for you. Let's see.
Are you going to mix them up to trip me
A
up?
little bit. Try to mix them up a little bit. So, what kind of work is your mainstay of what you do? Like, what do you want your body of work to express personally?
I think that the sort of the thing that matches in all of my work, or the sort of defining thing, is that I like to find that tension point between things. So often my work starts in the studio and then it works into the public spectrum, and I'm doing social justice work or I'm working with a public group, and then I pull it back into the studio. But it's always about that tension between things. Like in the fracking series, it's that tension between having natural gas to make my hot tea in the morning and being part of a community that's being decimated by the natural gas industry. So I'm always looking for that tightrope, that point of tension that is the in-between space of something. Like, where's really the crux of it, and where is maybe the flashpoint?
And that point isn't always obvious for a lot of people to ascertain. So the artist is able to bring this kind of into a focal point. So when you say the material actually defines the project itself, how do you go about choosing which material you will work with next? Say you finish a project with iron, do you say, well, I'm gonna do 2 or 3 more projects in iron before I start something on fabric or something on canvas? Or how do you choose which mediums you're gonna use for your projects?
It's kind of the idea that chooses the medium. So I had finished, part of the fracking series is cast iron, but another part of it is our hex signs. And hex signs are traditionally painted and then outside exposed on a building. So I ended up having to sort of learn how to paint with aluminum discs and sign painter's paint, right? Not a painter. But the vocabulary of a hex sign and of the Pennsylvania Dutch demanded a flat object as opposed to something cast. So with these pieces, which are maybe far less political, the idea became about, I had these diagrams that I was letterpressing. So letterpress was going on paper, but then I was really loving the transparency of them. So then I started drawing on the fabric, and then I started making these welded steel forms, and then they got sculptural. So things sometimes evolve. With the prison series, iron makes sense because iron is an instrument of the prison system. It is a tool of the prison system. So that authenticity of the material becomes really vital there. Like casting in aluminum for the prison system doesn't make any sense to me at all. It has to have that integrity of material.
Very, very intriguing. So as a professional artist, what was one of your first jobs?
I think I had a macrame business when I was 12. I think the first job that really, as an artist, made a difference was that I was a studio assistant for a man named Izar Patkin in New York City. And I ended up with the job because I was in trouble at school, and the dean kind of was like, okay, I have this former student and he needs help, and you're going to go help him until we get you sorted.
As a punishment?
It wasn't I don't think it was a punishment. No? I was really struggling at Cooper, and I think she just saw the struggle and thought that he and I would connect in a way that he could ground me in a better way. So he was working on this extraordinary project he was making a four-walled room that was 2 stories high that was essentially a painting of Jean Genet's play The Blacks. And I was cutting stencils of all of the figures, and the play unfurls itself on the 4 walls on the 2 stories in the play. And working with an artist, I think my struggle has always been that I'm not a traditional artist. I can't draw. I don't paint. I really struggled with the idea of what an artist was, even though I didn't really have a choice of being an artist. But I think we were spray painting these onto folded rubber panels, rubber curtains essentially. And I think that I finally understood that you could be an artist in any kind of material. That the thing that I had been saying in school and everyone had been telling me I was wrong about was actually true. Yeah. That I didn't have to have one expertise, that I could really think about ideas through materials, and that job repositioned the way I saw myself in school. So I ended up finally finding a groove, and then I worked for him for maybe 10 years on and off, doing other kinds of things. Yeah.
So he had a really big influence on your creativity and your creative process as an artist.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And you had a friend that you showed me some of his work, and he worked with golf bags in this dense leather material, once again proving that any medium can be used to, in the creative process to produce art. It doesn't necessarily have to be brush on canvas, paper on pencil, or, it can be anything that we find attractive to us. So what have been the challenges of your career, your hardest jobs, and your most difficult clients?
Well, I think my career is pretty interesting. If you look at my CV, I was doing high-end interior design in New York City. I have a custom design company, Sugar Jones, that does, all kinds of really interesting projects. And I have worked, in Mexico and California and New York and all over the place. And I think that, and then I was an educator. Then I ended up back here in Pennsylvania with kids, and I was like, eek, and eek on so many levels. But then suddenly, like, some avenues ended up opening up in teaching. I'd been doing some in New York, and so suddenly then I was an educator, right? So there was like all of this, like, oh, now I'm an educator. I need to know all this stuff. I need to do all this stuff, and that was really exciting. And now my education career seems to be in limbo. I mean, first of all, in the middle of the pandemic, I don't have a job anymore, and art school in the middle of a pandemic is really, like, we have this wonderful opportunity to redefine all of that stuff, right? So, I mean, I think for me, it feels like a career that just keeps unfolding, right? That, like, I'm doing one thing and then that leads to the next thing and that gets really interesting and then I go down that wormhole. It's been really, I think the most challenging thing has been the sort of larger community projects. And I think, and I'll get in trouble for this one, but I think the most frustrating one, honestly, has been that we managed to build a sculpture park in Scranton and that it is being dismantled and that there is no love for it and there is no home for it, and that all of the years of, like, trying to toot the horn about how arts make a city just feels like I never got the traction to get everybody, enough people to buy in for it to stick, So I think probably that's been my most challenging thing, or the public things like the big iron festivals and things like that. Those are just challenging because you're not in your studio. You're not in control of your material. When I'm working on this, I'm in control of all of it. But when you're doing public work, there's so many bigger considerations.
With public works have a lot of pieces that need to come together at the same time to make them work. But at the same time, like, public art is something that I think really adds value to a city, a community, and we definitely lack a lot of that here locally. But with you and other organizations that around here, seeing some more public art projects go around, the Northeast Mural Project, they have a lot of things going on. Like you said, the Keystone Ironworks have been doing things for decades. And even the Black Scranton Project has some ideas for, public works of art, which I think just helps to vitalize the city and keep, you know, people happy about living in a city that has beautiful art. And I didn't know we were taking down the sculpture.
Yeah, there's no support for the park, so the sculptures are leaving kind of one by one quietly. But you know, somebody's got to keep beating that drum. Like cities that have public art projects are happier cities. They're healthier cities. They're, you know, they're cities that attract people. Like somebody's got to keep beating that drum because there are great people in Scranton doing public projects, and I just, you know, I applaud all of them.
What would you like to be doing 10 years from now with your art?
I don't know. More of it. I want to be doing more of it. I mean, I'm trying to set up a situation where I'm in the studio more, that the kind of work that I do is maybe more separate. I mean, I really love teaching, but it would be false to say that teaching doesn't pretty much suck the lifeblood out of you. It's really hard to leave the studio when you're teaching and come into your own studio. You know, you end up working in these gap times, and I think the next iteration of me will be more kind of design work that I can put aside. I work for a client, I get it done, and then I can really be in the studio kind of cleaner and clearer and, you know, with more energy than I have been in the past. So it's kind of my goal. Those 12, 14-hour grueling days in the studio with small lunch breaks. And
very familiar with those days.
Right?
And like you said, it's I have not been in the education field as a proper teacher, but like you say, doing work for someone else and trying to switch that mode and go into your own zone and your own creative areas and try to produce work can, you know, flipping that switch doesn't always go so easy for me. If I'm working on a commission for a client and then I have something that I'm working on for myself, it seems like I have to stay in almost like a business-minded mode in order to work for someone instead of a purely creative type mode when I'm just trying to be free of my own art. So I can absolutely see, like you said, in the next 10 years, just more of what you want to do and enhancing what you already have. Let's see if we can find one more good question. What artists or professionals have been your biggest influences?
Alice Aycock, Robert Smithson, a lot of the land artists and people who are looking, again, at people who are very engaged in both a narrative and an object and a material. I've been very interested in public art projects. Muriel, I never say her last name right, Eulikis. She did this project in I think the 70s where she like shook the hand of every garbage man in New York City, and she did all these other projects. So I'm still very interested in artists who are working in the public in some kind of way, where they're very directly engaging non-artists in their work and letting that be part of the vocabulary. Francis Bacon, huge fan. I mean, there are a ton of artists that influence me in different kinds of ways, but I think Robert Smithson would, you know, probably be pretty far up there. Yeah.
And that's something else too that I've actually had to. I think it's a process. Well, for me, it was to go from creating art that's beautiful to art that's meaningful. And I love beautiful art, but I feel like now where I'm at, I'm more attracted to art that has a substantial meaning behind it and not just something that's pretty to look at. And so your art has always affected me that way because I know there's so much more than just the structure of the art pieces, the meaning and sophistication that goes into the piece itself. So
thanks.
Let's try to deconstruct some of the art that you've brought today.
So this is from a series. Florence Knoll is from Knoll Textiles and the mid-century furniture design powerhouse. But Florence Knoll was really the hub of that entire organization. And what she did is she kind of built an atelier at Knoll Industries where she brought in weavers, she brought in architects, she brought in designers. So I had started buying these letterpress diagrams of defunct objects, like things that would have been in a science publication or a mechanical diagrams, but like they have no context or meaning now. So I started printing those, and so the fabric covered buttons are kind of an homage to her, but then the diagrams are all blown up diagrams from the International Correspondence School in Scranton. So this is sort of, this whole project is kind of an overlay of systems. And when I was talking about Alice Aycock, she sort of references these abandoned systems or older systems. So you have the system of like this idea of an atelier and all of this creative hive, and then you have the systems from the letterpress and how we communicate information. Like diagrams are so important in our life, but diagrams can be false, right? After science changes or information changes, a diagram can be misleading,
This is true.
right? And then in this idea of International Correspondence School, which is funny now that we're in a pandemic, right? Everyone's corresponding to school, everybody's phoning it in. But like that's literally how you got an education, right? Is you'd buy this little packet of these beautiful blue books, and they'd leave Scranton and they'd come to where you were, and you'd do the work, and you'd send them back in the mail. So like that's also a system, right? Like that person's education depended on it leaving Scranton through the post office and everything being there. So this project was something I started to do when the prison project got to be too overwhelming. I mean, when your bedtime reading is books called, Systems of Constraint, sometimes you need to lighten it up.
A little bit.
So this project was kind of like a step back from the grief of this other project. But these are all things, again, like the prison project is about systems, the Marcellus project is about systems. So it's just, this is another kind of system, and maybe a prettier one, right? And I got to buy a button machine. I've been jonesing for a button machine since my mother sold hers. So now I own one in case you need a fabric covered button.
I like fabric covered buttons.
Who doesn't?
But this piece it's very interesting, just from the main shape, the circle, and the different mediums that are on here, the fabric, the ink, the paper, the metal and the fabric from the buttons. It's so eclectic, and it does really feel like a structured system in itself, just like you said, the blueprints and diagrams on here. Your stuff is so intriguing, Nikki. I really, really love it.
Thanks, Travis.
Let's see what else you brought for us today. So can we set this piece up?
We can set, this is actually a piece in process. I brought this, I think we can get it up there, and it's...
Or would you want to do the other little ones first?
Oh, that's not gonna work.
Oh,
you know what, we
yeah.
can look at these little guys. These are from the that Marcellus hex sign project that I was talking about. So after a number of projects working along fracking and discussing what happens in fracking, I landed on this idea of using hex signs, Pennsylvania Dutch, local to Pennsylvania. We were sort of this hotbed area. So this idea of taking the vocabulary of a Pennsylvania Dutch sign, so what does yellow mean? What does, how do they communicate a system of protection in that? And then overlaying the language of the Marcellus Shale. And one of the most important things was in the Pennsylvania Dutch, all of those signs are about protection and abundance of the community. So you have this disconnect in the Marcellus Shale is, individuals were making money, companies were making money, but the community's resources were being tapped without there being a community yield. So this idea that this is a symbol of abundance, and in yellow, the golden sunshine, the golden wheat, but this is a fracking derrick, and it only goes down to one well, which one homeowner gets the proceeds from, right? So, and then the other one, the most fascinating thing about the well pads for me was that they all had these candy cane. They would take PVC pipe and wrap it with red tape, and that would serve as the warning sign for the perimeter of the site. But it looks like candy canes, like Candyland. And then invariably, I don't think I ever found a site that didn't have these used car sales flags. They were never just orange flags or orange and white flags. They were always rainbow colored flags. So it was like you thought you were rolling up to the Clifton Fireman's Picnic. I mean, like it was just made no sense.
And it's a fracking site.
And it's a fracking site. And then the unicorn in the language of the hex signs means folly, someone who's not for the community, someone who's foolish. But that is the horse that is on Pennsylvania's state seal. So I took all of the horses from the state seal and I turned them into unicorns, because Pennsylvania, in my opinion, and you could argue a lot of this, but didn't really regulate as well as they could have. They didn't really tax as much as maybe they could have. They failed to navigate what would support the community.
More than the corporations themselves.
Right.
You know?
So again, this idea of sort of meshing the vocabularies of these two things, and these are just little ones. The ones that are my favorite are 4 feet in diameter,
wow.
and some of those have been purchased and they're on people's houses, and it's just great
amazing.
to roll up and see one up there. And then they function as a warning sign. I mean, not as a warning, a bit of a warning sign, a sign of warning, a sign of protection, but as information, right? So you have to know a bit of the language to dig into these to know what they are. But I think if you did a little bit of research about both, you could extrapolate the narrative. So it's a little more tucked in.
Well, I love it. I love hidden metaphors and hidden symbols or symbology, just like the yellow for the wheat, and the significance of the different colors, and what could be identified as a warning sign or an invitation to kids, depending on
Right.
how do you interpret the symbology behind it. So once again, your stuff is always makes me think, you know.
That's
and,
good.
And that's and that's the part that I like. Is it pretty? Yes, it's appealing to the eye, but it really makes you think, and I think that's the most important part of your work. It gets people outside of the box and starts these really deep and needed conversations. So a lot of people don't talk about fracking anymore, or you know, the dangers behind fracking. So, well, what else do you have here on the table for us?
So I brought a finished piece and an unfinished piece, and this is one of the first pieces from the prison series. And so I've been working with these diagrams of architecture, and so all of the work that I do requires a ton of research. Like I'll spend sometimes 6 months or a year just reading before a project really starts to become objects. So I've been looking at the intersection between systems of incarceration, prisons, workhouses, poorhouses, religion, architecture, and philosophy, and how those have changed over the span of time since we started locking people up. And then I started to do these iron castings that literally are just a version of the architectural diagram. So let's just start with like the form. And because the form actually changes how prisoners are treated, whether it's a penitentiary where the idea is that everyone's in solitary and that you're being penitent so that you can reflect on your sins and grow as a person, or you have more severe systems where really no one wants anyone to feel like they're a better human. They just want to belittle them and destroy them. So this piece actually sits on 2 pillows, sort of shallow pillows. The outside pillow is divided in a pretty classic color graph of the census information from the United States of America. So white, Hispanic, black, other, and Asian, right? So you have this essentially graph grid. But the second pillow is the census population of the prison system. And you can see this amazing, dramatic disparity between the population. So you have this gigantic black population in the prison that doesn't match up at all with the population in general. So, you know, that's like, we know this now, but these kinds of things, sometimes when you can see it in a more innocent version and you can go, wait,
something's wrong with that.
Okay, so that's wrong. And then you have to start to tease out how we got there, So this is one that's not finished yet. This is just the casting. And this is this is sort of a multiple panopticons. The panopticons were where you were being watched all of the time. So these are single prison units off of a main hub, but a central guard could watch almost everyone simultaneously. So these I've got about 8 of these now, and I think I'm going to start turning them into sort of games of chance. Because in a lot of ways, where we're born defines how close we get to this system. So I'm really working on, I'm still doing some research, and I'm really working on how would it feel if you walk up and spun that and it sort of had a colorful carnival-like atmosphere behind it, but it said, oh, you're going to jail. You know, there's no, it's not like Monopoly, there's no get out of, but maybe it is. So I've been really thinking about these as games of chance. And it's difficult now, I mean, like, in navigating this idea of presenting information so that you can think about it and start to challenge it and start to discuss it. But these have been really difficult to navigate. I mean, first of all, you know, with everything that's been happening and with this, you know, murder after murder of Black people in the United States, and then just with what's happened in the election, and there wasn't a clear push away from that this stuff is really hard to make. I'm having difficulty. I'm really having to sit with this, and I'm having trouble about where the message is, and I'm really questioning some days I'm questioning whether, you know, like, I'm the right person to be making this work even. So there's a lot still going on here, but maybe that's good. You can share the struggle. The struggle is real.
This is definitely an amazing project, and the explanation makes it even more amazing that you've been able to take this difficult, complex system and try to, like, break it down into small, understandable parts that we all can get basically at a glance. And it's like, this is how we live in our society. Right. And this is a part of the system. And it's amazing that you've, once again, to take this complex thing and to break it down into almost its most simplest elements is amazing. I love your art, Nikki. You're such a wonderful artist.
Shared admiration. I love yours too.
And I really appreciate you coming to the studio today and having a conversation with me.
Thank you. It was an honor.
This has been another episode of Electric City Television's Roundtable Discussions. I'm your host, Travis Prince, and our guest for today was Nikki Moser. Thanks again, and see you guys next time.